Sweetgrass Country, Montana Territory, 1886, the first green week of May. This is grass country, where the wealth is not under the ground, but lying right on top of it in plain sight. 100 miles of creek-bottom hay and shelter coulees that will winter a cow when the high bench kills her, and out here the law says any citizen may have 160 acres of it for 5 years of living and a filing fee. Which is why the men who wanted all of it had to find a way to make the living part fail. The stranger came down off the bench on a black horse in the last light of an afternoon, and along the creek he passed the first chimney. It stood alone in a square of burned sod, a good fieldstone chimney with the swallows already nesting in it, and around it the black print of a cabin that was not there anymore, and 100 yards on there was another, and past the bend a third, chimney after chimney, standing up out of the new grass like gravestones with the names burned off. He looked at that row of chimneys the way a man looks at something he has already seen in 100 other valleys, because a burned-out homestead wears the same face everywhere, and he did not have to be told what had been done here. He wore a brown felt hat pulled low, a patterned wool poncho gone soft and pale with dust, a blue neckerchief, and a gun belt with one worn colt in it, the hammer resting on an empty chamber the way careful men carry. What happened here happened because the homestead law, which was written to give a poor man a farm, had one door in the back of it, and the men with money had found the door. The law said 5 years of residence and improvement, a dwelling, a well, a plowed field, and at the end of it the settler went before the land office with 2 witnesses and proved up, and the quarter section was his forever. But the law also said that a claim without a habitable dwelling was an abandoned claim, and an abandoned claim went back to the government, and anybody could file on it fresh the next morning. Nobody in the Sweetgrass had ever been shot for his homestead. Shooting was crude, and it hung men. A cabin, though, is only wood. A cabin can burn on a windless night in the week before a man's proving date, and if the government's own inspector rides out and finds no habitable dwelling, then there was never any crime at all. Only an unlucky fire and an abandoned claim, and the law working exactly as written. And the widow crying at the land office counter is not evidence of anything except that women cry. The outfit that had learned this was the Kestrel Land and Cattle Company, and its brand ran on more cattle than any 3 outfits in the territory together. And its money was Eastern and English, and did not live in Montana, and its will was carried by one man, Major Alden Croft, 51, straight-backed, courteous. A man who had commanded volunteers in the war and had come out of it with the settled conviction that the world belongs to whoever is best organized. Croft did not hate the settlers. He needed the creek bottoms, because the open range was dying, and the outfit that owned the water and the winter hay would own the country after it died, and the settlers were sitting on the water, and so, in the same spirit in which he had once ordered a bridge burned to shorten a war, he arranged for the bottoms to come back onto the market. He never said the word fire. He had a foreman for the saying, Rafe Odom, 36. A wide, quiet man with a rope scar under one ear, who picked the nights and carried the coal oil and had it done, and was home by morning, and in 3 years not one match had ever been struck in the presence of a witness who would say so. And the government, which was far away, had one pair of eyes in the country, a special agent of the General Land Office named Lyle Fenn, 44. A neat man with a barbered mustache and clean cuffs, who rode out after every fire and walked the black square with his hands behind his back, and wrote in his report, no habitable dwelling, claim abandoned, entry canceled, and drew his government salary and banked in a Helena account that was not in his name, a second salary that was considerably larger. In 3 years, 19 claims along the Sweetgrass and its feeder creeks had been canceled for abandonment, and every one of the 19 had burned within a month of its proving date, and every one of the 19 had been filed on within 60 days by men who turned out, if you followed the papers far enough, to draw wages from Kestrel. And no one had followed the papers, because the man whose job it was to follow them was the man being paid not to. There was an honest man in it, which is always where the real damage lives. Newell Prother was the register of the land office at Fort Maginnis Road, 58, a careful man with a bad hip and a fair hand, and for 3 years he had entered Fenn's findings into the track books exactly as they came to him. Canceled for abandonment per report of Special Agent Fenn 19 times, and he believed those reports the way a man believes the government he has served since he was a boy. A federal report, he would have told you, sworn by a bonded officer who had stood on the ground himself, was the one thing in a lying world that could not lie. It had never once occurred to him that the eyes of the government could be rented. He recorded the lie in a fair hand and called it the record, and that was the most dangerous honesty in the whole country. There was one more man who mattered, because he knew the one thing none of the others had trouble to learn. Gideon Sass was 65, a freighter, and for 30 years he had hauled everything the country ate and burned, and freight is a business of counting, and Gideon Sass counted everything and forgot nothing. He knew that the Kestrel Home Ranch took delivery of case coal oil 4 times a year, 10 tins to the case, and he knew to the tin how much lamp oil a bunkhouse full of cowboys burns in a season. Because he hauled for every bunkhouse in the country, and he knew that Kestrel burned lamps like everybody else and bought coal oil like a town, and for 3 years he had hauled the extra cases and kept his ledger and said nothing to anybody. Because a freighter who talks is a freighter who finds the road closed to him. But he knew the thing, and the thing was this, that a fire may leave no witness, but the oil that starts it is bought somewhere, in tins by the case, off a wagon, and wagons keep books. The creek was not a ledger either. There was a young woman named Tamsin Rook, 27, who held the best quarter section on the whole Sweetgrass, the Bend claim. A horseshoe of bottom hay her husband Harlan had filed on in 1881, and Harlan Rook had built the cabin and dug the well and broken the field, and in the 3rd winter he had died of a fever in 8 days, and Tamsin had buried him on the rise above the Bend and stayed. The law allowed a widow to carry her husband's claim through to proof, and she had carried it 4 more years alone, hay knife and milk cow and lamplight, and her 5 years came ripe that spring, and her proving date was set at the land office for the 12th of June, and on the night of the 3rd of June, windless and dry, her cabin burned to the sod while she was sleeping in it, and she got out with a quilt and a milk pail and the deed box, and stood in the yard in her bare feet and watched 4 years of her life and the whole proof of it go up in a column of sparks. She did not see a rider. Nobody ever saw a rider. In the morning the neighbors came, the few that were left, and looked at the black square and the standing chimney the way people look at a thing they have seen 19 times, and said nothing above a murmur, because the ones who had said things above a murmur were gone from the country now, and by noon everyone on the creek knew that the Bend claim would be found abandoned on the 12th, and canceled, and that some rider drawing Kestrel wages would file on it before July, and that there was not one thing in the written law of the United States that anybody could do about it. On the 2nd morning the stranger rode down to the Bend and found Tamsin Rook living in her hay shed, boiling coffee on a stone fire with a milk cow watching her, and he sat the black horse at the edge of the yard and told her the thing no one on the creek would say out loud. That fire was bought, he said, by the case the same as the other 19, and the man the government will send to certify you burned out is the man the buyers pay, and on the 12th he will stand in your yard and write that you abandoned this place, and it will be sworn federal paper, and it will be a lie from the first word. Tamsin looked at him a long moment over the coffee, and she did not cry, because she had done her crying at a graveside 3 winters back and had none left for lumber. "I know it," she said. "Every soul on this creek knows it. Knowing has never yet kept a roof on a house." "No," he agreed, "but the law they are using says abandoned, and abandoned is the one lie in the whole business that can still be beaten, because you are standing on your ground, and I have 9 days. Now, before the rest of this happens, you should understand that the swindle was real even if the writer is not. In the Homestead West, the proving up was the narrow gate of a poor man's whole life, 5 years of labor funneled down to 1 morning of paper. And the government that promised the land had one inspector to a country the size of a nation, and where the witness of the government is one hired man alone, the truth of the government is for sale at the price of one hired man. The great cattle companies did not need to jump a claim at gunpoint. They could let the settler do the 5 years of work, burn the dwelling in the 6th week of spring, and buy the abandonment for the price of a case of coal oil, and none of it was hidden. Exactly. It was done in the dark, certified in daylight, recorded by an honest man, and reviewed by nobody, because the reviewer was the arsonist's customer, and that was not a flaw in the arrangement. That was the arrangement. On the 3rd day, the stranger did a thing that made no sense to anyone who watched it. He rode to the settlements up and down the creek, to every family that was left, and every family that had been burned out and stayed in the country to work for wages, and he did not ask them to sign anything, or swear anything, or fight anybody. He asked them to come to the bend with their tools and their wagons on Thursday, and he asked Gideon Sass to haul in a load of sawn lumber and shakes from the mill at the Judith Gap, and he paid for the lumber in gold coin out of a flat money belt. And when Sass looked at the coin and then at him, the stranger said, "A man told me once you keep a fine ledger." And Sass said nothing at all, but he brought the lumber, and he brought his ledger too. And on Thursday morning the sweetgrass did a thing it had not done in 3 years of fires, which was to gather. 11 wagons came down the creek road. Men came who had been burned out themselves and had swallowed it, and their wives came, and their children came, and old man Kettleson brought his broadaxe. And the Pruitt brothers brought a window sash they had saved out of their own fire, because you save what you can, and from sunup Thursday to dark on Saturday the bend rang like a shipyard. And a cabin went up on the old foundation, square-notched, tight-shaked, a door on leather hinges, and the Pruitt sash in the south wall, and a stone hearth relayed from the standing chimney, and Tamsin Rook's bed and stove and table carried in, and smoke put up the chimney and beans put on the stove, because the law said habitable dwelling, and the stranger stood in the yard reading the law's own words off a printed circular, and said, "Then we will hand them a dwelling so habitable the government can smell the supper cooking." Among the men who came to work that week there was one nobody knew. A lean, quiet man past 50 who had gotten down from the Judith stage with a carpenter's chest and hired on with Sass's freight outfit 2 days before. And he was a good carpenter. And he kept to himself, and he slept in the hay shed with his chest locked, and nobody paid him any mind. Which was exactly what the man wanted, because his chest held better tools than chisels. His name, though nobody on the creek would learn it for another week, was Everett Dana, and he was an inspector of special agents for the General Land Office, sent out of Washington that spring, quietly, on the strength of a stack of letters that had been arriving on a desk there all winter. Letters with no signature, written in a plain, strong hand, laying out 19 cancellations, 19 fires, 19 refilings, 60 days apart, 3 years running, with dates, and the last letter had said only, "Come to the Sweetgrass before the 12th of June, hire on as a working man, and watch what happens to the Widow Rook's new cabin, because they cannot let it stand, and the man you are paid to audit will be the man who swears it never stood." The stranger had mailed the first of those letters from a town far to the west, 3 months before he ever rode down off the bench, because he had learned long ago that a trap is not a thing you spring. It is a thing you plant in the fall and harvest in the spring, and he had come to the Sweetgrass the way the fire came, quietly, ahead of the proving date, on purpose. Kestrel heard about the cabin on Friday before the roof was on. Croft heard it at his own supper table and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, to nobody in particular, that it seemed a pity for the neighbors to have wasted such effort on a place with so unlucky a history, and Rafe Odom finished his coffee and went out. And that was the whole of the order, the same as it had been 19 times, because that is how it is done where the theft is organized properly, no order given, no order needed, a pity spoken over supper, and a case of coal oil gone from the wagon, shed by midnight. Odom was not a fool. He waited for the moon to go dark, and he took 2 men he had used before, and they came down the creek on the night of the 10th of June, 2 nights before the proving, riding on grass the whole way, leading a pack horse with 4 tins of oil in the panniers, and they left the horses in the willows a half-mile below the bend and came up the last stretch on foot with a tin in each hand, and the cabin sat dark and dead quiet, with one thread of banked fire smoke standing out of the chimney. And it was all exactly the way it had been 19 times, except that 19 times there had been nobody awake on the ground, and this time the ground was awake all around them. The stranger was sitting in the dark inside the new cabin with his back to the hearth and the colt on his knee, and he had sat so every night since the roof went on. Tamsin Rook was in the hay-shed with the door barred, under orders she had accepted with bad grace. Gideon Sauce was lying in the willows by the horses with a shotgun he had no intention of firing and a lantern he had every intention of lighting. And in the loft of the new cabin, at the little Pruitt window under the shakes, lay the quiet carpenter with a night glass, and a notebook he could write in by feel, and a federal commission in his locked chest that outranked every paper Lyle Fenn had ever signed. Odom's men came up on the south wall and knelt and worked the cap off the first tin, and the sound of coal oil going on to new pine boards is a small sound, a dry drinking sound, and it had always been the last sound of the world's attention. And Odom struck his match. Bang! It was the only shot fired on the sweetgrass that night, and it took the burning match and the top joint of one finger, and Odom was down and rolling with his hand in his armpit before the sound came back off the bench, and the door of the cabin stood open with the stranger in it, and his voice went out over the yard flat and level. Stand where you are. The oil is on the wall, and the tins are in your hands, and the match is in the grass still smoking. And there is a lantern coming up from the willows behind you, and I want you to understand before anybody moves exactly how many eyes are open. Sass's lantern came bobbing up through the dark, and the 2 men with the tins stood like posts, and above them all the loft window opened, and the quiet carpenter leaned out into the lantern light with his notebook in his hand and said, in a voice that had read charges to better men than these, "Gentlemen, my name is Everett Dana, Inspector, General Land Office, Washington, and I have had you in this glass since you left your horses, and I have the time, the tins, the match, and the man, and I will want the name of whoever spoke a pity over supper." They tied Odom's hand, and they tied all 3 men, and nobody came to any further grief that night, and the beans got eaten after all, and it is remembered on the sweetgrass that the widow Rook came out of the hay-shed with her quilt around her shoulders and looked at the 3 of them roped in her yard and said nothing at all to them, but went to the south wall and laid her hand flat on the oil-wet boards, on the cabin her neighbors had built her twice, and stood there a while and went back in. On the morning of the 12th of June, the proving of the Bend claim came on at the land office on the Maginnis Road, and it was a proving such as no land office in the territory had seen. Lyle Fenn was there, barbered and clean cuffed, because it was his duty to be there, and he had heard nothing of the night of the 10th, because the stranger had asked the creek to let him not hear, and the creek, which had held its murmurs for 3 years, held this one for 2 days more with a kind of grim joy. Fenn rose and stated for the record, smooth as bank paper, that he had inspected the Rook claim on the 4th of June and found the dwelling destroyed and the claim without habitable improvements, and that it was his duty to recommend cancellation for abandonment, and Newell Prather at the register's desk dipped his pen to enter it, because it was a sworn federal finding, and his tract book had a line waiting for it. "Enter it whole," said a voice from the back, and the room turned, and the quiet carpenter came up the aisle in his working clothes with his commission open in his hand, and laid it on the register's desk, and said, "And then enter after it that the inspecting officer is relieved of duty and under investigation, that I stood inside the habitable dwelling on the Rook claim last night while 3 men in the employ of the Kestrel Land and Cattle Company poured coal oil on its south wall, that they are in irons at Fort Maginnis this morning, that one of them has this hour made a full statement naming his foreman and the practice of 3 years, and that this office will now produce for me the tract books covering every cancellation for abandonment on the Sweetgrass since 1883. Newell Prather did not enter anything for a long moment. He sat with his pen off the paper and looked at the open commission, and then he did the thing he had done all his life, the only thing he knew how to do, which was to serve the record. And he stood up with his bad hip and fetched the tract books himself, 3 heavy volumes, and opened them flat and began to read his own fair hand aloud. Canceled for abandonment per report of Special Agent Fenn. And he read it 19 times, and somewhere around the 7th time his voice stopped being a clerk's voice, and by the 15th it was the voice of a man reading his own confession, and when he had finished he looked up, not at Fenn, but at the room, at the burned-out family standing along the back wall, and said, in the flat, sick voice of an honest man doing the worst arithmetic of his life in the open, I recorded every one of these. Whose valley have I been keeping? And nobody answered him, because the answer was standing along the back wall wearing its funeral clothes. Fenn tried, once, he said the word irregular, and he said the word jurisdiction. And Everett Dana looked at him the way a carpenter looks at a splitboard and said, Mr. Fenn, I have audited 40 crooked agents, and every one of them said jurisdiction before he said nothing at all, and you will want to get on to the nothing, because the freighter's ledger is already in the record, and it has you meeting the oil. For Gideon Sass had come forward that morning and laid his 30 years of counting on the register's desk, the cases, the dates, the deliveries to a line camp that kept no lamps, and a freight ledger is a humble kind of scripture, but it does not forget, and it placed the coal oil, case by case, in the season of every fire. Here is what the trap bought, because you should have all of it, and not only the part that warms you. The Bend claim was proved that morning, first of all the day's business. Tamsin Rooks 5 years and her 2 witnesses and her twice-built cabin entered whole, and the patent came up from Washington in the fall with the seal on it, and she holds the Bend today. And the hay goes up every summer off ground that no company on this earth has any paper on. Rafe Odom was tried at Helena for arson, on his man's statement and his own 9 fingers, and he served 4 years, and said not one word about suppers or pities the whole time, and Kestrel paid his family's keep every quarter he was inside, because that is the wage of the quiet. The 2 men with the tin swore their statements and drew short terms and left the country. Lyle Fenn was dismissed the service and indicted, and his trial went 2 seasons and died of continuances, because the Helena account was not in his name, and the man whose name it was in had sailed, and he was last heard of selling town lots in the Cherokee Strip, a licensed man again, because a man who will certify anything never wants for work. And Major Alden Croft was never tried at all. There was no statement with his name in it, no order anybody had heard him give, nothing in his hand but a supper table remark that 3 years of fires had somehow understood, and the government, which could hang a foreman's man, could find no law with a shape that fit a pity spoken over coffee, and so it fined the Kestrel Company for the trespasses of its employees, and the fine came to less than the company had spent on coal oil, and Croft paid it the way a gentleman pays a gambling debt, promptly, and resigned his management that winter with his fortune whole, and went east. But the fires stopped on the Sweetgrass, and they did not come back, because the one thing the arrangement could not survive was the thing the stranger had arranged, which was an audience. 19 times the fire had worked because the government's only eyes were bought, and the 20th time there had been eyes in the loft, eyes in the willows, eyes at a desk in Washington reading unsigned letters, and a company can buy one inspector, but it cannot buy a country that has decided to watch. And now the colder part, because this account does not owe you a warm ending, it owes you a true one. The company's Eastern counsel was a Chicago lawyer named Silas Marchbanks, a soft-spoken man who had never smelled coal oil in his life and had learned that a man need not burn anything if he can arrange for the law itself to do his burning. And in a paneled office on LaSalle Street, he read the file on the Sweetgrass matter once, for the one useful thing in it. He did not care about a widow or a cabin or a foreman's finger. He found the single flaw the writer had exposed, which was that arson requires arsonists, and arsonists can be caught and can talk, and he wrote one memorandum to his clients advising that henceforth no employee of any client company touch any match, and that instead the companies avail themselves of the contest provisions of the land laws, by which any citizen may file a legal contest alleging a settler's entry to be fraudulent, and hold the settler's patent in suspension for years of hearings, at a cost of perhaps $50 in fees and affidavits against the settler's whole savings in lawyers and lost seasons, until the settler sells cheap and moves on, all of it lawful, all of it paper, no oil, no rope, no witness in any loft, because the witness in the loft cannot testify against a filing fee. He fixed it, not the theft, the fire. Next spring, in some other valley, the best quarter sections will go to the company that can afford the most affidavits in broad daylight with a docket number, and the settlers will sell for the price of the lawsuit they cannot pay for, and it will not even make the papers, because a contest is not a crime, and that is what a man like that does with a writer like this one. He does not hunt him. He reads him, closes the one door the writer found open, and makes the next theft too lawful to catch fire. The stranger rode out of the sweetgrass on a Sunday. Tamsin Rook walked the black horse as far as the row of chimneys at the mouth of the creek, and she tried to give him back the gold that had bought the lumber, and he closed her fingers over it and told her that a patent is only the beginning of keeping a place, and to spend it like the winter might be long. She asked him where he was going. "Nowhere," he said. "That is the whole trick of it." Behind him a creek that had watched its cabins burn by the calendar for 3 years put up its hay in peace, and far to the east a soft-spoken man in a paneled office turned a page with a clean, dry hand. The bounty on a man with no name and a black horse went up that month by $500, posted by nobody, and the Helena paper ran 8 inches on a curious night at the Rook homestead and never once printed the word Kestrel. He rode south, toward whatever was waiting on the road ahead. He was not happy. Men like him do not get happy, they only get a little further down the road, and a little more alone at every gate. Before you go, I need one thing from you. Comment below. 3 words. Where are you from? The country, the city, the place you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know who is out here on this road with me in the dark. This was the story of the Sweetgrass, a valley that burned by the calendar, a company that never gave an order, and a stranger who understood that you do not catch a fire by chasing it, you catch it by building it one more thing to burn and filling the dark around it with eyes. Where does he ride from here? Comment below and help me decide. Subscribe so you do not miss the day he finally rides east, to the paneled office on LaSalle Street and the clean, dry hand and the man who learned to burn with paper. And one more thing. Tell me which one you believe truly rules that country. The match in the foreman's fingers or the memorandum that makes the next fire legal before it is ever lit. Like this video, if you believe the real enemy was never the man with the coal oil, but the pity spoken over supper and the rented federal eyes and the lawful little filing fee that can take a widow's 5 years without striking one match. See you on the next road.